Hey, my name is Becky Panetta. I'll be your host for today. I'm the Agriculture Conservation Planner with Marion Soil and Water Conservation District. Matthew Sheppard has spent more than 30 years collaborating with people from all walks of life to create better places for wildlife. Matthew's career began in England and took him to Kenya before his arrival in the United States a couple of decades ago. He has worked for the Xerces Society since 1999, initially at the vanguard of a national campaign to protect pollinators, but now focused on outreach, community engagement, and urban conservation. Matthew is author of numerous articles and other publications, including Attracting Native Pollinators and Gardening for Butterflies.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction, Becky, and thank you for inviting me here today. Hello to you all out there. I hope you can see me and hear me successfully. I'm going to launch into a presentation in a moment, and I'll speak for maybe half an hour, a little longer possibly, and then I'd like to open it up and make sure there's plenty of time for conversation questions, because I always hope that at the end of any time when I get to give a presentation that people, you actually leave with information that's useful to you, rather than just like, Matthew's got all these things that he thinks is fascinating and just wants to tell you, because if you don't find useful information, then I know that for a lot of occasions when people start thinking about butterflies, bees, pollinator gardening, wildlife gardening, the focus is on flowers, and we need to be thinking a little more widely than just flowers, and that's what I was asked to come and talk about today. Before I go to that, I just want to introduce you to the Xerces Society. We are an environmental non-profit organization. Our mission is to protect the natural world through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitat. We're based in Portland, although we work nationwide, and beyond the United States, but we currently only have staff in the US, but we have staff in about 20 states now. We are named after the Xerces blue butterfly, which is the first butterfly known to go extinct in North America because of human activity, and it used to live on the San Francisco Peninsula. And as San Francisco, the city, and all the cities around it expanded, and particularly as it moved towards the Pacific, all the habitat that the Xerces butterfly used to live on disappeared. And it was last seen flying in 1943. And at the most basic level, we are trying to prevent further extinctions. And this photograph is, it was a chance discovery one time. I realized that we have a copy in our library at the office of the only book that seems to have the Xerces blue in it, and that's the John Comstock's Butterflies of California from 1927. So that book's a bit of a treasure. So as an organization, Xerces works in a number of ways, but we focus on conservation, and by that I mean on the ground conservation, so creating new habitat, because if we're not expanding habitat, then we're not really doing what we can for insects, other invertebrates, and wildlife in general. We also are involved directly with advocacy, and most of that revolves around protection of rare and declining species, and also trying to reduce unnecessary pesticide use. We are involved directly in research because as an organization, we are a science-based organization, and we like to make sure that everything we say, all the management plans, all the advice, all the guidance, all the advocacy is actually based on evidence. And so we are both involved directly with research such as surveys and understanding biology and natural history, but we also partner with scientists in universities to support and partner with them on research as well. And then we do education outreach. We produce books and publications, we give talks, we do walks, we do all sorts of things. And although, the time I've been with Xerces, we've grown from a handful of staff to now to more than 70. The organization is bigger than the staff, and so we have more than 13,500 members, probably closer to 14,000 now. We have dozens of volunteers who go out and table and present for us. We have hundreds, probably thousands of people who volunteer their time and their energy to do community science projects, helping us understand where things live and their habitat needs. We are supported by private foundations and businesses. We're kept scientifically honest by our network of scientists around the world. And we partner with agencies, landowners, farmers, gardeners, all sorts of people to try and make sure that there's change on the ground. Oh, that's interesting. Maybe I just went the wrong way. Oh, I think I may have just had that slide duplicated. Sorry about that. So as I said at the beginning, creating a garden, flowers are a really important thing for bees, butterflies, insects of all sorts. And you might look at a garden full of bloom and think, wow, that's fabulous. Give yourself a pat on the back, say, haven't I done a great job? And for sure, flowers are fundamentally important, but if we really want our gardens or natural areas, wildlands, farm field edges, roadsides, all those places where we could be having habitat, if we really want those areas to be supporting and as good for insects as we can make them, we need to make sure that we are supporting the entire life cycle of those bees, those butterflies, those beetles, those flies, whatever. And so, yeah, flowers are important as providing food, nectar and pollen for the adults. But they also need somewhere to lay their eggs. They need somewhere for their caterpillars to eat. They need somewhere for their pupae to be. They need shelter from winter, bad weather, etc., etc. And that often means that we don't want to have a pristine, perfectly manicured, immaculate landscape. We need to have untidiness. We need to be allowing things to get tumbled down. We need to be having bare ground. We need some, places where bees can nest, whether that's in the ground, in a twig, in a bee box. And we need shelter for the times when they're trying to survive the winter, or shelter from rain, etc., etc. And so I'm just going to go through some of the things to highlight some of the ways in which I'm mostly going to talk about bees, to be honest. And partly of that is because if I were to try and talk about every different type of insect, it would just get so utterly confusing that I'm pretty confident you would walk away with just like too many random thoughts in your mind. And by focusing on bees, we can not only be supporting the group of insects that is most important as pollinators for us, but also creating a really solid foundation that will support many, many other types of insects. So the natural areas where bees will be nesting is in dead trees and snags, in the hollow twigs of shrubs, or in bare ground. And most of our bees are solitary. So you probably are thinking, the chances are a lot of people think when you think of bee, you think of honeybee and you think of hives and honeycomb, etc., etc. And the majority of our native bees are solitary nesting. So one female will be making her own nest. And the majority of those bees actually nest in the ground. They need access to bare soil, and they will dig a tunnel in, and they will make a small cell, a small cavity off that, supply it with nectar and pollen, lay an egg, and then seal that egg. Seal that brood cell. And the same thing happens in beetle tunnels, hollow twigs, and so on. The bees collect materials and they divide up that tunnel into a series of brood cells, with each one supplied with nectar and pollen and an egg laid in it. And our female bees, the majority of our native species, will be active for just a few weeks. And then the female dies and their eggs will remain in the nest. and the eggs will hatch, the larvae will eat the food, and then they'll pupate in the nest. And they'll remain in the nest for a year until they emerge the next year. And so when we're thinking about bees nesting on the ground, bees do need access to soil. And it doesn't mean that they need, vast area of bare ground. It can often be very small areas. I mean, I've seen places where there have been, a thin layer of bark chips with gaps in between, and the bees will get in between those. Bees will nest in around the edges of rocks. They'll nest in patchy grass. They don't need large area, but they just need access to the soil. And so, increasingly we see people putting down plastic mulch or landscape fabric, covering all of that with a thick layer of bark chips or bark dust. And all of that limits the access that the bees can get to the soil. I'm saying that don't need large area. This photograph shows that only about 6 or 7 inches between the edge of the concrete driveway and that basalt rock there. And you'll see right around the edge of that rock, you can see there's holes and there's a little bit of dirt that those bees have kicked out as they've been burrowing in. So again, it's just, you don't need huge area, but you do need to provide access to the soil. So, you might be mulching a flower border. Don't mulch the entire area, mulch the minimum that's needed. Providing access to bare ground is a really important thing. We can also be making nesting blocks for bees. And you can buy these. You can buy blocks for leafcutter bees or mason bees in many garden centers now, but you can also make your own. And again, this is kind of replicating that natural, if you can keep dead trees, snags standing, then that's great. The bees will occupy those. If you have plants such as elderberry or raspberry or sumac, for example, those are all shrubs that have hollow stems or the very soft pith down the twigs, and which the bees will nest in if there's broken ends. But depending on the size of your landscape and the type of garden you have, there may not be a room for those. So we can create nests. All we're doing is we're providing the tunnels, replicating those kind of natural conditions. So you can have a wooden block, drill holes between 3/16 inch diameter and 3/8 inch diameter, and you'll find there's bees that will occupy those different sizes. Drill them 4 inches to 6 inches deep. If you can go further than that, that's great, but with small diameter drill bits, you can't get that deep. So drill as deep as you can. And you can also, you'll find some plants like bamboo, common reed. There are some other plants that sometimes grow as weeds on a roadside, like teasel. They have naturally hollow stems. And so you can just get a bundle of those stems, cut them just below the node on the stem, which is where the stems branch, where the leaves come off, and there's often a ridge around the stem, because at that point the stem is always going to be blocked. And then you just create a long tunnel from the open end to the blocked end. And you can tie them in bundles, you can stick them inside containers, all sorts of different things. And all we're doing is just kind of providing those same sort of tunnels and conditions that might naturally be occurring. And if you do go for these artificial nest blocks and so on, it doesn't really matter how high off the ground you set them, but if you can place them so they're facing east or southeast, then the morning sun will warm them up, and they won't get too hot in the summer. My own personal preference is about 4 feet off the ground, with an area in front where I can get a lawn chair in. Because it's really neat to sit and watch the activity as the bees are coming and going, because you can watch the different nesting materials they bring in. You can see them come in, with pollen load on them, and typically the pollen is carried on the rear of the body, so they'll land on the block and then they'll go in backwards and they'll scrape the pollen off, and then they'll come back out And then if they've got nectar in the crop in their throat, then they'll go back in forwards and regurgitate the nectar. And then you'll see them pop out and they'll dash off on another foraging trip. And these nests, these artificial sites really do work. Here's just two examples. The upper one, all the holes are sealed with chewed up leaf pieces, and the lower one is a mason bee, and all of those bamboo canes have been sealed with wet soil. And again, you can sit and watch all of these kind of activities. And so it's a good educational tool and kind of a nerdy, fascinating thing to do. They do work, but it's good to keep in mind that if you're creating a really big nest site, you're creating a really large resource for other things to exploit. And sometimes that's parasites, or there are wasps that will lay their eggs inside these tunnels that then kill the pupae. There are actually cuckoo bees, despite this idea we have of bees being super hardworking and diligent. There are bees that don't make their own nest and sneak in and lay eggs in the nest of other species. There are fungi and diseases that will get in there, and most of those kinds of things will benefit more if there's a large concentration of nests. So it's good to make smaller nest blocks and scatter them around so that there's less of a concentration, and you're going to attract fewer things, whether that's a disease or another animal trying to eat it. And although I've been talking about these as supporting bees, you will get wasps occupying these, because in the same way that with bees, we tend to think of bees being, hive dwellers, big colonies, and yet the majority of bees are solitary and gentle. It's the same with wasps. We might think of wasps as yellow jackets or hornets, but the great majority of wasps are solitary nesting, and bees and wasps are very closely related. And will occupy the same kinds of places for their nests. And so if you have a bee block up, you'll frequently see grass sticking out, and that's a type of wasp called a grass carrier wasp. You can be sitting there with your nose right up against one of these and peering down the tunnels with a flashlight, and these wasps will just fly past your nose and climb in and out, and they don't care that you're there. And then the bottom one, this is a ground nesting wasp, a great golden digger wasp. And you can see that it's just occupied this kind of sandy soil. This was actually in a school playing field on the edge of a baseball diamond. And it's got a tree cricket that it's about to drag down into its nest. Bumblebees are a social bee. They live in a small colony. It's not a perennial colony like a honeybee, nor is it as large. It's a seasonal colony, so the queens overwinter and then emerge in late winter or early spring and start a new colony. And through the summer, over the next few months, the colony may get to 60 or 80 bees. One or two species may have a couple of hundred, but most of them are less than 100 bees at the biggest. And they're seeking a small cavity. Naturally, that might well be a chipmunk nest that's been abandoned, or a mouse nest. It could be a tumbled down patch underneath fallen grass or vegetation. But you can also make a box. You can replicate that cavity. This is a wooden box. It's about 8 inches on each dimension, just kind of a cube. There's a little bit of soft material in there to make it a little more attractive for the queen looking for somewhere in winter. This example is upholsterer's cotton, but you can gather dry moss, you can snip up short lengths of wool. There's all sorts of things potentially you could put in. You could use dryer lint if you collect that. And then a pipe. This is a rigid plastic pipe, but you could use a length of hose pipe, just something that kind of replicates a mouse tunnel, a chipmunk tunnel entrance, and then tuck that away in a nice quiet corner somewhere. And there is a chance that you'll have a bumblebee occupy this, but all the studies suggest that probably no more than 1 in 5, maybe 1 in 4 of these artificial boxes get occupied. So the reality is you're better off trying to have untidy, tumble down, chaotic areas where the bumblebees might naturally find a mouse or a chipmunk and that kind of stuff. And so moving on sort of specifically from bee nests, there's also things that we can be doing to create shelter and overwintering habitat for all sorts of insects. I said that bees will be in their nest for a year. So from the perspective of most of the bees, the solitary bees, their overwintering habitat is provided by that nest. But it also means that that nest area should be stable because it needs to be occupied for 11 months or more. But there's lots of other things that we can be doing in our landscape to be creating shelter and overwintering areas. And again, a lot of this comes down to just not being super tidy. I know that in some areas of the country, and I don't know about Marion County, I mean, Salem, Kaiser, these places, there's like homeowners associations, and they have really strict rules about how long your grass can be, and, how tall your plants can be, and should your bushes be trimmed back, and all these kind of things. And so much of that is complete opposite of what the insects are wanting. And so often for people, there's this idea of, manicure, even green, whatever, but all these things that people feel is attractive is just not attractive to insects. And so we start looking at ways in which, how can you bring, untidiness back into your landscape? One of the simple ways is, here we are, it's fall, the leaves are beginning to gather on the ground. And do you need to remove every leaf that falls to the ground? Well, no. This is actually great. You can actually do more for insects by doing less work. And sometimes people think it's lazy gardening, but it's not. I think of it as thoughtful gardening. And it's with leaves, there are all sorts of things that if there's leaf litter there, you'll be supporting ground beetles and millipedes and all sorts of beneficial things that need that leaf litter that you'll be benefiting from in ways you may not realize. The ground beetles are in there, but they're chewing on and preying on other species that are potentially pest species. But also these areas, those overwintering bumblebees, they do not overwinter in their nest. They leave their nest at the end of the summer, and they burrow into the ground, into the soil an inch or two, and a layer of leaf litter at the base of a shrub or a base of a hedgerow is fabulous overwintering conditions for a bumblebee, for example. So you may have areas where you don't want leaves, pathways, steps, your lawn. You may find some plants where you don't want the leaves gathered around the plant. Around here, rose bushes are a good example of that. If you have black spot on your rose bushes, the great way of reducing that is to keep the ground bare around rose bushes. And I live up near Portland, City of Roses. This is what this area is famous for. But where you can keep the leaves, you can sweep them, rake them into flower borders where they'll provide mulch to suppress your weeds, hold your moisture in, will also degrade down and improve your soil. You can pile them around the base of hedgerows or shrubs or trees, all these places where you can keep leaves and will begin to be improving the conditions for all sorts of insects. And we do recommend that people avoid shredding leaves when they can, because it's remarkably quickly, once things have fallen, that insects will move in. And there are some species of butterflies that lay their eggs on fallen leaves, and then their caterpillars, it's their first meal, and others that overwinter amongst them. So if you're shredding, you may be shredding up the insects. So it's better to rake or sweep or move them in a more gentle way. You can also change how you manage the stems. And again, kind of conventional gardening is, here we are as we move into fall and over winter, we chop things down low. And that's how we prepare for winter. But if you leave the stems standing, then not only do you provide seeds for birds, but you can also eventually be providing more nesting habitat and more cover for insects. When it comes around to spring, your perennials, by then the birds will have eaten the seeds. You can cut your perennials down anything between about 8 inches. There you go, about 8 inches and 2 feet is great, and a variety of lengths. And then you can leave those stems standing, and fairly quickly the regrowing perennial will just have, the new growth will have covered those brown stems, and you can just leave those stems standing. And there are, many of those stems have hollow centers, and those are the places where the bees will go in. And that lower photograph shows that's a small carpenter bee working its way into it, make its nest in a trimmed off stem. And you want to leave those, once you trim them, you want to leave those stems, because if the bees do occupy them, their offspring will be in that stem until the following year. So again, it's a slightly easier way of managing your stems. You can also build piles. Now, if you're a typical gardener in the suburbs, you probably don't have room for a 15-foot high log pile that's 30 feet long, but you can make much smaller piles. And these are the kind of spots where you might get mice or chipmunks moving in. You may find sparrows and all sorts of birds will occupy them. So by creating these kinds of features, you're creating habitat that's suitable for more than just insects. And so, these are just nice to have around. And again, it's kind of creating a bit of chaos. You can tuck them in the back corner of your yard. You can slip them in behind a shrub, stack them at the base of a hedgerow. You don't have to put these out in the open where, you might annoy your neighbors, because sometimes neighbors do get annoyed by untidiness. But it's just another way of trying to bring some cover and chaos back into your yard. You can do the similar with rocks, either building a rock wall. And around here, many people have kind of basalt walls or stacked rock walls. You put a rock wall in, and you can create gaps and spaces in between. You can also just have a handy little pile of rocks. It doesn't have to be real rock. If you've got concrete chunks because you've been ripping up or remodeling or whatever, all sorts of materials you can work with. Again, you're just creating something that provides the gaps, the voids, the cavities, the shelter, the stability that insects need. This idea illustrated here of using old pallets stacked up to make an insect home, I think came from Europe, but it seems to be increasingly adopted here. This example is from a demonstration garden from the Washington County Master Gardeners up near to where I live. And it makes a distinctive, attractive feature in your yard if it's big enough, and it's fairly simple to do. Or it's just stacked up. They have some old pallets. They separated those pallets with bricks so that there's a gap between each of the pallets, and then they just stuffed all the gaps in between, all the void, with all sorts of stuff that they could find: straw, some of those stems that they trimmed off in the spring. There's broken terracotta pots, there's complete terracotta pots, there's bits of rocks, there's all sorts of bits and pieces in there, and you're just creating a whole diversity of small cavities and hollow stems, all sorts of little places where butterflies might overwinter, or lady beetles might shelter, or ground beetles and predatory beetles might get in there, as well as bees and other insects that may be occupying some of the little tunnels in there. What you do have to do if you're doing something like this is you do have to clean it out, because I was saying with the nest blocks, you get parasites, you get diseases, you get all sorts of nasty things moving in. And that will in time reduce the value of this feature. And so what the master gardeners here settled on as a way to do it was they divided it up into 4 sections, horizontal sections, and then one each year they clean out one of those and put fresh materials in. And that means that there's a constant renewal of materials and this kind of sustainable cycle. You can also do this kind of approach of just creating little spaces with whatever materials you have. This is an example of something I made for my yard, and I just, we replaced, it was a wooden fence, cedar boards down the back of our yard, and we replaced it with an open metal fence when the old wooden one rotted out. And I reclaimed some of the boards and just made this, and I just stacked them up and filled the gaps with bits of stone and wood chips and dug fir cones and all sorts of things, just to create those little spaces. I also made this one. We were given an ornamental wine carrier, which is not something that we ever had a use for. So I took it out and I stuck it in the yard with a few stems in there and reed bundles and wooden blocks with holes drilled in. And it's great. I mean, again, there's so many different ways of doing this. You just have to kind of let your imagination go. And then without having to have any particular structure, it's good to just have untidiness. You see there in the upper photo, that's just some stems that got cut one spring, and I just bundled, got a bundle and just put them in the back of that area there up against the bottom of the fence, and it creates again, just create some of those little cavities, some of those little hollow tunnels that the insects and everything else will go into. And then a larger, untended, more chaotic, more overgrown, those are the areas that are removed from our gardens, from our landscapes so frequently, and which we need, if we really want to support insects, bring back into our landscape. And then just kind of wrapping up, Xerces Society, we have our Bring Back the Pollinators campaign, and it's based upon 4 principles that can be adapted to any location, which is flowers. Grow your pollinator friendly flowers. Obviously that's a foundational thing. Providing the nesting and egg laying sites, and extension from that, all of this overwintering habitat and that chaos that I've just been talking about. Avoiding using pesticides. Obviously insecticides in particular are targeted at killing insects. So if we can keep our habitats free of those, then that will be better for insects. And then the 4th principle that we recommend is share the word, because if every gardener gets one neighbor to do something in their yard, then that could just be a profound impact. And sometimes sharing the word is as simple as sticking up a sign. It doesn't have to be a manufactured sign. It can just be a bit of cardboard which you write on with a Sharpie. It's as simple as that. But you can go to our website, bringbackthepollinators.org. We'll take you to the page on the Xerces website, and you'll find more information there. And there's also the pledge that people can sign if they wish to make a kind of more public commitment to supporting pollinators. And then also from our website, which is xerces.org, you can go there and you'll find there's a bunch of fact sheets and brochures and guidelines and all sorts of free materials that you can download. You can have PDFs, you can print it off. We also have books on pollinator gardening and butterfly gardening that I realize I don't have a slide for, which is, but you can find those in libraries, you can find them in wherever you prefer to buy books. You can also go to YouTube, the Xerces YouTube channel. We have webinars and videos there. So if you want to explore some of these things in a little more detail, you'll find that. Or some people just prefer to watch, and it's easier for them to learn from watching and listening than it is from reading. So that's another way for people to access information. You can also follow us on social media at Xerces Society on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and we share hints and tips and guidance and announce new materials and share our blogs and all sorts of stuff there. And then I need to say, Xerces Society, we are donor supported. So if after this you felt you wanted to support us, that would be wonderful and be really appreciated. Thank you. And my last slide, this is my own garden. In fact, many of the photographs were from my own garden. I do actually practice what I preach, and live in a neighborhood without a homeowners association, so I'm grateful for that. But have had some conversations with neighbors who thought my yard was a mess. But equally have inspired some other neighbors I've discovered, because they've said to me, oh, we saw what you were doing, and so now look at what, we planted these in our yard. So just by being an example, you can have an impact beyond your own garden. So thank you. I'll stop sharing my screen, and I'd be very happy to try and answer all your questions.
Let's see, our first question. How important is it that nesting boxes have overhangs to keep water off of the bees?
I don't think it's terribly important. And I say that based upon the fact that if you were to look around at a snag, for example, I don't see a roof or an overhang on a snag, or those vertical stems that bees will very happily occupy. I don't see roofs on that. So I don't think a roof is necessary. It's one of the things that if you put a roof on it, probably doesn't do any harm. But if you don't have a roof, if you only have an old log that you want to drill holes in, or you only have a 4x6 offcut or whatever that you want to drill holes in, that's just fine. I don't think a lack of a roof will deter things too much.
Great. Let's see, Michael, I see you have your hand raised. Go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Matthew, great presentation, and Becky, thanks for having this today. Super cool, super cool. We had I got three things. We had these purple long flower things in the yard that drew bumblebees all year long by just the masses. And so I was wondering where they went. So it sounds like they go into the ground. How do you figure out where in the ground they go?
Do you mean for the kind of a nesting colony, or for the overwintering?
For the nesting colony. Where do they go at night? And so somebody said,
oh sure. Yeah, no, I mean, finding nests is a real challenge. And people have trained dogs to sniff out bumblebee nests in some parts of, dogs are, in the same way that you can train a dog to sniff baggage for drugs at an airport, dogs have an incredibly sensitive but amazing. And so it's being done, but even with that, it's actually not much more effective than just walking around and stumbling across them.
And so would they be locally, or would they go?
Oh, yeah, they will be locally. Bumblebees, just to backtrack, in terms of how far a bee can fly, it is really related to the size of the bee. And the bumblebees are big bees, an inch long. And so they can fly a fairly long way, a quarter, half mile, maybe a mile, but inevitably they don't fly further than they need to. It's kind of simple energy economics. If you only need to fly 100 yards, you will, as opposed to that. But on that as well, I'll just mention that some of our smallest bees are 1/8 of an inch, 1/10 of an inch long, and they may fly no further than a couple of 100 feet in their lifetime. That's the other reason for trying to make sure there's nesting and overwintering close to the flowers.
In the pictures you showed, there were the soil looked like it was hard, compact soil. Is there a better type of soil for them to be in? And then what type of wood would you recommend using if you're drilling the holes?
Yeah, for the soil, we don't know, and there are like 3,600 species of bees in this country, of which 70%, so about 2,500, are ground nesting. And we don't know what the ideal conditions or the preferred soil type is for all of those. It does vary from clay to sand, and even some that are more extreme actually nest in sandstone and will bring water in to soften the stone. Which is like, can't you find something simpler? But that's what they prefer. So, you know, they probably sandier or loamy soil is generally preferred. But if you stop and think about it, the bees will be nesting in their local soil. You know, so, I mean, I know it's, it took me a while to figure that one out as well. So, and I've been thinking about bees more than many people. But so they must be, because, you know, they must be in all these areas, bees are naturally occurring. So they must be using the naturally occurring conditions. And so although they probably would prefer sandier soil, and it is possible to like dig a hole and put sand in it, or have a pile of sand, or, you know, dig your dirt and mix a lot of sand in so it breaks it down. But fundamentally, the bees would naturally be nesting in the soil that occurs in their local area. So I'm not too worried about what type of soil it is. It's most important for there to be access to the soil surface. And that's what typically is lost from so many of our landscapes as we're trying to make them look neat and tidy for our own aesthetic benefits. You also asked about wood. Mm-hmm. I don't know if it does make a lot of difference on the type of wood. Certainly avoid something that's being pressure treated, okay. Yeah, you know, with chemicals, because that's not good. There are some people who think that we should avoid Western cedar because it has a natural, I mean, there's a reason why people use cedar for closets and clothes chests and so on, because it does actually have a natural insecticide. It's so your clothes won't get clothes moths, for example.
So we're going full on. We're getting, we don't live in an HOA. Last statement here, we're going tearing out the lawn and putting in a mess. And so we're going to follow your lead there. Thank you so much for the presentation today.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you.
Okay, next up, this is kind of fits along with talking about the types of soil. Can drilling holes in the ground help, or do they insist on digging their own holes?
So I don't know. I don't know anybody who's tried that, to be perfectly honest. That's intriguing. I mean, again, it's like, try it, find out, let us know. Yeah, it's possible, because I mean, there are some bees. It's like, you know, I was talking about tunnel nesting bees, and they divide the tunnels up. Well, like leafcutter bees do that with neatly trimmed pieces of leaf that they make. And if you were to open up one of the nests, it looks like a bit like a lot of little stubby short cigars down, because each one of those is, but there are some leafcutter bees that nest in the ground. And so, you know, again, there's always this variation that with so many different species of bees and so many different behaviors, it's impossible to be kind of talking absolutes. It's like they always do this or they always do that. Well, they don't. They all do their own thing. And so we're trying to create the conditions that will allow them to do their own thing. And so there are bees that, for example, will nest in existing cavities. And so if there are, you know, existing cavities, you know, behind bark, between rocks, inside old snail shells, all sorts of strange things. And so if there are already, you've made holes in the ground, there may well be bees that will occupy that. So that was probably a long answer to say, try it.
I think we appreciate all of the extra information, so that's totally fine. Let's see, next, will pruning the stems of perennials in the spring not damage insects nesting in them?
I mean, that there is that possibility. But on the whole, the insects, for the bees to nest in the stems, they need a broken stem. And so if you leave the stem standing, they'll be unbroken until you trim them. So there's less opportunity for things to be nesting in the stems. That said, yeah, it's possible because there is such a diversity of insects, including grasshoppers and moths and all sorts of things that may be or maybe inserting eggs into a complete stem. And so that's one reason why I showed you that photograph that had a bundle of stems at the base of the fence, because I do trim the stems, but I don't dispose of the stems. I stand them in a corner somewhere, or I lay them down in bundles so that I keep those stems for another year or two.
Great, well, that just answered I believe it answered anyway, our next question.
Oh yes, I just see that.
Yeah, so it's great. We also had another question that went along with that though. I've noticed bumblebees staying overnight on a flower head. Is this common? Is that because the nest is too far from where the bee happened to be foraging?
It's probably just that the bees were foraging out late, and because they just cooled off, and once they get cool, it's hard for them to heat up and remain active. The other possibility is that they're male bumblebees, because the male bees, for the bumblebees, the males are come late in the year. For the solitary bees, the males will emerge around the same time as the females. I mean, that makes sense, because what's the point of having a male in May and a female in June? You're going to run out of bees pretty quickly, because when the female bee is laying the egg, she can control the gender of her offspring. If she fertilizes the egg, it will become female. If she doesn't fertilize it, it'll be male. And that's why with the bumblebee nest, once they get towards the end of the summer season, that's when the new fresh queens will emerge, and so that's when they need males. And for the solitary bees, when they're laying creating the nest, most of the cells will be fertilized eggs, so females, but then there's always a few that are unfertilized males, so they emerge. And the males don't have, when they've emerged, they will not have a nest to go back to, because the females are making the nest, and they'll return to the nest probably in the evening or bad weather. But the males don't have that. So male bumblebees, also males of solitary bees, will spend the night on plants, on vegetation, sheltered somewhere. And you can find, particularly longhorn bees, you sometimes find sleeping aggregations of them, where you might have 6, 8, 10, 20 of these bees all huddled up together. They're very cute bees. They just huddle up together on the plant, and often they just clamp their mandibles, their jaws, onto the plant, and you can find them and they'll just be like hanging off the plant stems. And they're just that's where they spend the night.
Next question, do mason bees continue to use the to return to nests year after year?
No, they don't. By the time the bees have left the nest is a pretty nasty place. Not all the bees will emerge, so you end up with some dead bees in there. You also could have parasites and fungi in there. The bee, in the process of transitioning from the larvae to the pupae, they defecate. So it's, the nests are pretty nasty. And so the bees won't reoccupy those nests. They need fresh nests for the following year.
So if we're providing nest habitat in our landscape, would it be good to kind of clean those out every year, or like kind of reform them?
Yeah, you certainly can clean them out. And if you were to be involved with mason bee rearing, for example, there's lots of information about how you can take the cocoons out of the tunnel and clean them and sanitize the nest blocks, etc., etc., etc. And that's great for mason bees because you can do that. But for most of our bees, it's not really possible to do that because if you pull them out the chances are you're going to kill them. So it's better to, there's two things you can do. One is to put a fresh nesting block up each year, so that there's somewhere new for them to move to and to occupy. And then the other thing is that you may get a block that's occupied partially, or it may be 2 or 3 years, because sometimes the bees will skip emergence for a year, and if the year's too bad or too hot or whatever, they'll just like, I'm staying where I am. So it might take 2 years. So maybe after about 3 years, take your existing block down, and then you can clean it out, just taking a drill and re-drilling those holes, which is a bit messy. So, mask eye protection. And then you can, with a mild bleach solution, sanitize the nest block and then return that nest block to the yard. But if you're like using twig bundles or bamboo and such like, you really can't. So then you just end up after about 3 years taking that bundle and chucking it and making sure you put something fresh up.
Great. Let's see. I have another question here, and it kind of ties into one that was further up in the chat that I hadn't asked yet. How do you approach a conversation with disapproving neighbors? How do you keep it simple yet persuasive?
Yeah, no, I saw that pop up in the chat earlier. I'm like, ooh, that's a great question. Because the first time it said, are you friendly? It's like, yeah, of course I'm friendly. I don't want to get in a dispute with neighbors. That's just, that's partly because that's not who I am. I advocate things, and so from that perspective, I can be confrontational. I'm the kind of guy who's, when I'm walking in the park and there's a dog off a leash, I'm the kind of person who says, excuse me, I think your dog should be on a leash, and I get scowled at, but that's okay. So I'm not going to shy away from a conversation, but I'm also not the kind of person who's going to necessarily go out and kind of pick a fight. And so if neighbors disapprove, they're going to come to me and be the ones to open the conversation. And I don't see any reason in trying to make it into a big old argument, because if people get entrenched in their position, then it's really, really hard for them to ever, move out of that. There are some issues that are way bigger than just bees, because we could get into conversations about climate change, for example, and then you can, for some people that's like, no. So I do always just try and keep the conversation civil and friendly, and provide information, explain why I'm doing something. I haven't yet found someone who's really, really been totally unhappy with what I'm doing. I do find most people come and they're just kind of intrigued. They want to know, well, why is your garden so different? And I do have a pollinator habitat sign up, so that at least people know that it's there for wildlife reasons. And it may be that the neighborhood I live in, people are more accepting of what I'm doing.
Thank you. We have time for just maybe a couple more questions. So if you had another question, go ahead and place it in the chat. Reagan, I see you have your hand up. So if you want to go ahead and ask your question, go for it.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah. So
my question is, every year for the last couple of years, our fruit trees our apple tree, for instance, gets a ton of flowers on it. And this year was really nice because we didn't have a lot of wind that came and took the flowers away. But then we don't really produce many apples for the last couple of years. And somebody told me that they thought it's because we're lacking pollination. Would that be an issue with bees, or is that something else?
You could well be lacking pollination. I don't consider myself an expert on kind of orchard pollination, but for sure, apples, they do need it. I mean, they won't be self-fertile. The flowers won't fertilize themselves. They definitely need a bee to move the. And I say bee, it could be a wasp, could be a fly, you know, but they do need a pollinator to move the pollen around. Bees are typically the most efficient at that, and you know, you will find mason bees and mining bees. There's actually quite a number of native species that have been recorded foraging on and pollinating apple trees, in addition to the inevitable honeybees. You could consider having mason bees. They are probably the most efficient of the pollinators. And if you're like a commercial orchard crop, you know, you might take 2 or 3 honeybee hives to pollinate an acre, but which would mean 50, 60,000 or more honeybees. But you could pollinate an acre with just 100 or 200 mason bees. So for a small garden, you may only need a single mason bee block to provide adequate bees to pollinate your apple trees.
Okay, yeah, we're just a small 7-acre hobby farm, and we don't have, where the apples were for us or for our horses. And so that was that question. Thank you for your time. I would never have realized that wasps were considered a pollinator.
Well, they go to the flower to drink nectar, which is their energy, their fuel that allows them to go around and then catch a lot of things we don't really like. And so in visiting the flower, some pollen gets stuck to them while they're drinking nectar, and then it gets moved on. But they're not at all like a bee, which is actively collecting pollen and then moving from flower to flower.
Thank you.
In the chat.
Sure.
Well, Matthew, thank you again so much for joining us today and sharing all of your knowledge with us. I know all of us really enjoyed it. So thank you very much.